Hi, I'm very sorry that there were problems on the sound. I hope you can hear me loud and clear now. I'm David Miliband. I'm President and Chief Executive of the International Rescue Committee, which is a global humanitarian charity. The purpose of this webinar is to try and join our two worlds, your world of remarkable school leadership, which I know about through my friend Ken Gibson, who is, I think, the Vice Chair of the Education Mutual. He was a remarkable head teacher during my time as Member of Parliament for South Shields in the northeast of England. He's the head teacher of a multi-academy trust, as well as the former headmaster of Heart and Technology College. And I got to know him, and he said that you were all a remarkable group of leaders. And so what I hope you're going to do is type me questions on the basis of what I say. I've been sent questions in advance, but I basically think it's incredibly it's better if people respond to what you say. I can use these questions, but it'll be more interesting if you use the chat bar on your screen and send in some questions on the basis of what I say. I'd like to speak for about 10 minutes and then do 20 minutes of answering questions. You may be wondering whether I've taken up refugee status in southern France because of the backdrop behind me, these peculiar shutters. We have rented an apartment, a little cottage in northwest Connecticut, because my family and I decided 2 months ago that New York was not a safe or sane place to be for the outbreak of the coronavirus. And so we came out here into northwest Connecticut. We're going back to New York in about a week's time. The International Rescue Committee is a global humanitarian charity based in New York. We have a budget of about $850 million a year. We work in 34 war-torn countries around the world, helping people who are stuck in war zones in Syria or in Somalia or in Yemen, people who flee from war and are still within their own countries. Those are called internally displaced people, and those who are refugees because they cross a border into another country. So the COVID crisis, which is the first thing I want to talk about, is a double emergency for these people. And I want to talk a bit about what we're trying to do and what we're facing. The second thing I'm going to talk about is a little bit about crisis leadership, which you're all doing day by day. Ken sent me a message saying that the sound is coming through, so I hope I hope that's not an old message, but let's hope it is coming through. And then thirdly, quite a lot of the questions that came in were about the immediate issues in education and what should happen in the UK. I won't have a detailed stab at them, but I'll say a couple of things. So I'm going to talk about those three things, and then I hope you'll send in questions. I think I've got the right thing, the right bar open on the right-hand side here. No one's yet sent a chat through. Maybe someone could do that just to reassure me that I've got the right page open. So look, let me start with the 200 field sites in which we work. These are places like northeast Syria, where we have 600 staff. They're places like Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, in many ways undemocratic Republic of Congo. These are places where, in the Syrian case, where hospitals and health facilities are out of action. 1 in 16 hospitals in northeast Syria is working. 3 out of 250 primary care facilities are working properly. In Democratic Republic of Congo, there are 5 ventilators for a population of 100 million people. So we are a humanitarian charity that tries to help people survive, recover, and gain control of their lives by offering health services, education services, livelihood support, protection for women and girls and for vulnerable groups, and also livelihoods support. And our business is about bringing people together, so a bit like you in some ways. So the challenge of this, I do have a chat has come through, so it's working well. Test question: how was the rhubarb crumble, which I tweeted about the other day? It's working fine, thank you, Ken. And the rhubarb crumble was great. So we have been thrown a real challenge. We're in some ways an emergency response organization, and I'm very proud that our antennae were up in January because we saw what was coming out of China, and we feared the impact that would happen globally. I know from our Bangladesh team that they first ordered their PPE kit on the 8th of February, which I think speaks to good emergency preparedness. And we've been mobilizing to try and do as much preventative work as possible: hand washing stations, fever testing, isolation centers, so that people who've got the disease or have got a fever, which might be malaria, might be COVID, get separated from the rest of the population. We've been trying to boost up our health facilities. we've also been trying to minimize the collateral damage. And we're doing this at the moment without much government support. We depend for 3/4 of our income on government support, but we're struggling. Frankly, the governments seem frozen in the headlights and have not been doing their usual emergency response, which I think is is worse than a shame. And some of the media I've been doing, which you may have seen, has been trying to focus on that. Now, we've had three priorities through this crisis. One is staff safety. Secondly is frontline response, so health response. And thirdly, program continuity. How do we adapt our programs to work in a context where we have to be COVID proofed? We've been given the fortune of some time because most of the places we work haven't yet had the full force of the crisis that you've known in the UK or in parts of Europe or in the US. But it's coming. The first 5,000 cases in Pakistan took 45 days. The most recent 5,000 cases took 2 days. So you can see the exponential growth. And the underlying conditions of poor sanitation, poor underlying health, weak health systems, a high density, the population of 1 million refugees in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh has a population density between 4 and 7 times that of New York. So the conditions are there for the disease to run riot. That's the first part of the emergency. The second part of the emergency is the economic and social damage that will be done as a result. Economic damage, I'm sure you know about. Social damage, though, we know that in emergencies, violence against women rises. So that's something that we're trying to gear ourselves to work on. Now, questions are beginning to come in, which is great. So I won't disrupt, but I will get to them. So that means I'm not just going to drone on. The second thing I thought I'd talk about is how does one manage, how does one lead an organization of 13,000 employees, 17,000 auxiliary staff, those are day paid support staff, often refugees themselves, in 200 field sites where connectivity is not good, where underlying health conditions are bad, where sometimes conflict is raging, and an organization where the funding of the infrastructure of the organization is much weaker than the funding of the programs of the organization. And the truth is that I think there are 3 or 4 things that we've tried to prioritize in this crisis. The first is to make no apologies for putting staff safety first. If you can't protect your own people, you can't do anything. If you can't keep up morale, you can't achieve anything. If you can't maintain connections and connectedness, then you're going to lose your way. And so staff care, duty of care, staff communication, internal communication, global huddles, local connections have been really at the forefront of our minds. And I think there are some important lessons. It turns out that actually the level of communication and coordination could have been much stronger before. I've had people say to me they're cooperating more with colleagues now that they're away from them than when they were notionally running the old normal. So the first is about how you manage your own people. The second, which I feel very strongly, is that we work for our clients, but we live by our strategy. And our strategy is about being an outcome-oriented, evidence-based, R&D-rich organization. So we follow the evidence. We try to be disciplined in our programming. And I think that becomes more important in a crisis rather than less important. It mustn't become a straitjacket. You can't refuse to do common sense things because your strategy doesn't tell you to. But I think that it's really important not to lose sight of the North Stars that you are pursuing. And that leads us to a third element that we're trying to think about, which is rather than just adapting the old office-based systems, it's important to try and create new systems for working. And so rather than just take our old child protection policies and try and do them at distance, we're trying to reinvent our child protection policies so that they can be done in a COVID consistent way. That program adaptation piece is really important, consistent with our model of sticking to strategy and being outcome oriented and evidence based. So I think there's a third element, which is not just seeing the current situation as a minor tweak to the old one. It's a whole new business operating model. And it says, I got a message saying something had gone wrong, but maybe not. I hope you can all still hear me. And the fourth element of this is to try to find new partners. To try to find new partners in the private sector, to find new partners in civil society in the countries that we work in the field sites that we're working in, because they are a way not just of refreshing ourselves, but of helping us better fulfill our mission. And to the extent that necessity is the mother of invention, yeah, Ken says it's all very clear. That's good. The crisis, I think, gives us the opportunity to really challenge ourselves. And I guess many of you have been going through something similar. Let me just say, I said I'd cover a third set of topics, which is just a lot of the questions that came in were about the situation in the UK. I don't live in the UK at the moment, but I follow the UK, and I'm a proud UK citizen. And let's just see, there were quite a lot of questions about, yeah, do you think it's safe to return to schools? How confident and safe during the crisis can we be to remove the fear element? Is it an opportunity to overhaul the curriculum? I'll come back to that. Do you think, I thought there were a couple of others, if a member of the school staff contracts COVID in the time period they're working within the school, are they then embraced by the general local authority sickness pay conditions? I just don't know the answer to that. Should caretaking staff wear masks, etc.? So let me just say a little bit about what I understand to be the challenge that you're facing, and then invite you to ask some questions. First point is, my understanding is that it's wrong to talk about schools moving from being closed to open. Schools have been open throughout the crisis because of the need to serve the children of essential workers or kids for whom there is no parenting or caring situation. So this is about managing much greater access to the school. Secondly, from the debate that I've seen, it's carried a tinge of somehow teachers not wanting to teach, whereas everything I know from my time as schools minister is that actually what teachers love about their job is teaching, and what they hate is the things that get in the way of the teaching. So I don't think that's a productive way of thinking about it, but I want to broaden the question away. All the focus on teachers is understandable, but we know that support staff in schools are absolutely key, and so the reference to caretakers there, dinner ladies, etc. I don't want to generalize, but often they're older. The teaching force is younger, it's replenished every year, and again, avoiding generalizations, one has to be concerned about all staff, and if they're older, they're more at risk. So I would have thought that the second thing is that the safety precautions are really important for all sections of the schooling population. Thirdly, there's got to be a recognition of local conditions. And I spent quite a lot of time in my time as schools minister, unfortunately it was 15 years ago now, but spent quite a lot of time trying to fashion a different kind of relationship between teachers, head teachers, unions, and the government. We developed a social partnership model, which I think helped make the introduction of PPA time possible. It also brought associate teachers into the classroom, paraprofessionals. And I think we need some of that spirit now, recognizing local circumstance and recognizing local needs. I would have thought every parent is desperate to get their kid back to school, but safely. And every teacher is desperate to be teaching, but safely. In the US, my kids have been told that there's no school. They were basically out of school from the beginning of March, and there's no school till September at the earliest. So that's 6 months. There's a 3-month summer holiday here, which is completely crazy. And their summer camps have been cancelled. And I can see how the distance learning doesn't engage them in the same way, or it engages parts of their brain, part of which I don't want to have engaged. I mean, I want them to be have the whole of their brain engaged, not just part of it. And so I'm concerned about that. So I haven't got an easy answer for the questions that you're being asked, but I would have thought that the mindset needs to be that this disease is going to be with us for a good long time. Whether you go back in June or go back in September, the disease is going to be there, and the need to explain to kids precautions is going to be real. I don't know whether you're having a debate about mask wearing, but in school, but it's going to become the norm, I think, for many of us. It's required actually in New York State and New York City at the moment. So I'm conscious not to try and tread into areas that I'm not qualified to, and I don't want to sort of start stirring up professional difficulty. Let me just address the wider. A couple of the wider questions that were asked here. Dawn Dawson from South Shields actually asked about global responsibility and local responsibility. And I think that part of the new requirements for distance and for masks and for other measures is a teaching opportunity, because you can use that as a very graphic way of showing even young kids how the disease is affecting behavior and what a mature and adult responsible approach to that behavior would be. And so I hope that the disease does give an opportunity, not just to teach about the science of it, which my kids have been learning about, but also to teach some of the global aspects of it. This is a time when we're all focused on our own immediate circumstances, which is understandable. But I think it's really important to explain that this is a disease of the connected world, and it won't be tackled by establishing fortresses around national borders. It needs to be quashed globally if there's going to be any kind of real return to normality. So those were the three. I just wanted to do that by way of introduction. Now, if this is going to work, I will be able to get through some questions that come in here. Yeah, the chat is being moderated. Please put your messages in the chat box and they'll be passed on to me. I'm happy to take any questions. So how are you looking to plan for the medium term with respect to the ongoing impact of COVID? This is asked by Mark Howard. It's a good question. We were actually in the middle of a strategy refresh process when this crisis hit. We involved 1,000 staff over the last 6 months. And essentially, we're saying we'll continue that strategic planning process, but infuse it with a set of, with a red team, a special task force on COVID, who are going to produce 5 assumptions about the future on the basis of which we're going to work. For example, that global health is going to get better funded than it was before. Secondly, to pick out 3 opportunities for us as an organization. For example, to be the last 10 miles of the vaccine delivery. And thirdly, to pick out 3 risks of the for the organization. For example, that government funding falls as governments look inwards. And so we are going to try, and I'm a great believer that it's much better to have a view of what the future is going to be and for it to be wrong than to have no view about the future and just refuse to make any decisions at all. And so we're going to try and accommodate that balance of uncertainty with assumptions and learning by saying that our next strategic planning period, rather than just being a pure 4-year period, is going to be a 1-year seeding and planning period and then a 3-year implementation period. And so we're going to try and get the right balance between a changing climate with new things that we can do or different things that we can do while maintaining our focus. So I hope that answers that one. Where else have we got here? Yeah, Anne Seymour says, do you think it's too early to open schools? I mean, look, I'm not an epidemiologist, but I certainly don't think it's too early to be planning the opening of schools. And I think there are different schools in different places that will have the chance to open in a responsible way. I mean, it partly depends on how crowded are your conditions, what kind of infrastructure have you got, how many pupils have you got. My own instinct is that it's really important to try and work some model of getting kids back to school. And that needs to be done in a responsible way that recognizes the fears of teachers as well as the fears of parents. Now, that has to be done in a responsible way, as I say. Siobhan Ryan says, which world leaders are you working with effectively? Yeah, it's not a pretty picture for global cooperation at the moment, I'm afraid. the ones who've done quote unquote well, have done well within their own home circumstances, rather than have done well internationally. And the real story of this crisis in terms of the global scene is that there has been no global response of a serious kind. We are funded by UK, US, EU, France, Sweden, Germany. Germany's been pretty good, it has to be said. A lot of the others are pretty stuck, I'm afraid. And there's a whole very interesting international relations diplomacy angle to this, which is how China is being used as an excuse in America for their own failings. But the Chinese did do things wrong, and they are trying to, on the other hand, use their own successes in clamping down on the disease as a propaganda tool. So it's a very challenging. How do you? A question from Paul. Can't read his second name, I'm afraid, but it doesn't seem to be very clear. Paul Dunlop, maybe. How do you see the education world in 12 months' time post-COVID? So let me say two things about that. First of all, I would get into your heads that I don't think we're going to be post-COVID in 12 months' time. I'm really sorry to say that, but I've had this sort of shocking realization in the last 2 or 3 weeks. I was thinking, well, we're going to reopen our office in September, et cetera, but it's going to be September 2021, I fear, before a vaccine is really universally available in our own countries, never mind globally. I don't think I'm going to be traveling for this calendar year. And so the first point I'd make to Paul is I'm not convinced that we're going to be post-COVID in 12 months' time. Secondly, I think that education is actually ahead of the game in many ways when it comes to using remote learning, using online tools. It's something I saw a massive change in the UK 15 years ago. And I think that education probably has quite a lot to teach. One of the things that we're very hot on in the education work that we do around the world is that the machines aren't a substitute for people. And the best programs have a really harmonious balance of the teaching force and the online support. I think it would be a tragedy if the post-COVID world becomes a contactless world. And so my big push would be to try and figure out ways to maintain connections and connectivity between people, because education should be about bringing people together. Siobhan also asked, what are the issues facing women? That's a really good point. Hang on, there's another thing from here. Jill says, the problem is the amount of children, lack of space, and no track and trace. Yeah, that's a very good point. That, look, I should have said this, that you can only open schools in the context when the governing systems are actually working, when the testing is there, when the tracing is there, when the responsible isolation is there as well. So this is about how schools fit into a wider societal adaptation to this new abnormal. Thank you for saying that, Jill. Now, Siobhan asked, what are the issues particularly facing women? That's a really good point. Not just women, but women and girls. We know that in the places that we work, in emergency situations, in crisis situations, violence against women rises, poverty of women grows. And in the health crisis, since women are 70% of the official health caring workforce, never mind 70% of the informal care workforce, you can see the additional dangers and difficulties. What we see is those challenges not being properly met. I mean, an absolutely minute proportion of the global humanitarian budget goes on supporting women and girls directly. And it's something that we're very hot on. I wrote about this actually, and if you're interested, any of you, I wrote about this in a journal called Politico. If you go onto the website, I wrote about this with Sheryl Sandberg, who's the chief operating officer of Facebook. She and I did an article together about how we need data, we need provision, we need empowerment for women and girls, but we also need protection. I mean, what happens in crisis is that girls get sold off at a young age for early marriage and as a survival mechanism. And that's a huge area where child protection becomes important. So there are particular issues facing women. Olivia Gibson, I wonder if that's Ken's Olivia. That would be nice. How big? Oh, okay, that's Ken's daughter, Olivia. How big an impact do you think the UN failing to show support for a global ceasefire will have on the spread of the virus in vulnerable areas? That's a really interesting point that Olivia has made. Hi, Olivia. So just to back up, the UN Secretary General issued a call for a global ceasefire. And that has been followed in some places. There's a ceasefire in Syria at the moment. There's a ceasefire in Colombia at the moment. There's a temporary ceasefire in Yemen at the moment. But in some other places, there's a ceasefire in South Sudan at the moment. But there's not a ceasefire in Afghanistan. There's not a ceasefire in Somalia. And that is a major threat to the delivery of effective health systems, obviously. And the fact that Afghanistan is having huge increases in numbers, half of all those tested in Afghanistan are now registering positive, I think is traceable to in part, the absence of a ceasefire. Olivia asked about the failure of the UN Security Council, which is made up of the 5 permanent members, which includes the UK, and then 10 elected members. That body has not been able to pass a resolution supporting the call for a global ceasefire. It's incomprehensible, really, but it's a completely stupid debate with the Americans not wanting to say anything that refers to the World Health Organization. I mean, it's completely fatuous. And so I think that's part of the equation, Olivia. I think it's a good point. It's certainly a point that we're trying to make. Let's see, what else have I got here? This is Thomasin White says, do you think this pandemic should make the world review its attitude to the Ebola crisis in Africa? Well, that's interesting. I mean, I was on the Zoom with our team in DRC yesterday. It's Democratic Republic of Congo. That's the Eastern DRC is where the Ebola crisis has been happening. We are in the International Rescue Committee is in 84 health centers doing infection prevention and control there. I don't think that this crisis should make the world review its attitude to Ebola. I think it should learn different lessons from Ebola. And the biggest lesson is that the main asset in tackling a crisis is trust. If you haven't got trust, no one's going to use your healthcare facilities. And it's the credible provision of information that allows people to believe the things that they're being told. And so I hope that there is a lesson from Ebola for this crisis. I also think that the lesson of this crisis is a rather different one from Ebola, or there's a complementary lesson, which is that holes in the global safety net are dangerous for everybody. Martin Banham asks, which country's response to COVID are you least impressed with? Well, I mean, I'm a distance from South Korea and from Germany, but I think they've both handled it really well. Taiwan has handled it well as well. They've really been very clear about the science, what they do know and what they don't know. They've been very consistent in their messaging. They've been very fast to act. I'm afraid on the less impressed, I'm afraid the US situation, given the resources here, 18% of the economy goes to healthcare. I mean, it's been an absolute disaster. I mean, there's now the number who've died is heading towards 100,000. You know, the US is only 5 or 6% of the global population, but it's 20% of the global death toll. I'm afraid the UK, 1% of the global population, less than 1% of the global population, 15%, 20% of the global death toll. I think that worries me. I think that Brazil has been wildly irresponsible in the way that its leadership has dealt with the crisis, essentially telling people to go party. So there are some negative examples. I've chosen 3 positive examples from democratic countries, Taiwan, South Korea, Germany. You've also got to say that for all of their missteps, the Chinese have shown real rigor and determination. Now, they've got a one-party state that allows them to do things that we wouldn't do. But they've also shown extraordinary state capacity. When Wuhan blew up for the second time a week ago, they went and did 11 million tests in the space of a few days. So they've got real capacity, and I think there's going to be a very serious reckoning when this crisis is over. Let me finish with this question, because I think we're only meant to have half an hour, and it's now 9:37, so I've probably taken up more of your time than I should have done. the question is probably one I'm not qualified to answer. Let's see what it is. Ian Harrison says, COVID-19 is likely to widen the gap between rich and poor at all scales, internationally and within nations. What can your organization do to narrow the gap? It's an interesting question, or it's an interesting point. Actually, what I think is going to happen is that we're going to see a set of different widenings. We're going to have a new widening between the employed and the unemployed, because unemployment's going to rise. We're going to have, I think, new focus on low-paid workers and the rights that they have. In the UK, we take it for granted that we've got access to healthcare. Here, you've got low-paid workers who've got no medical care and have got no right to medical leave, so don't check out of work for fear of losing their income and therefore spread the disease. What's our organization doing? We're focusing on a particular gap, which is the gap faced, and it's a hole, the hole in the global safety net for people who are displaced by war and conflict. It's 34 countries, as I think I may have said earlier on. Those 34 countries have some of the most vulnerable people in the world. And so we're very clear that we're not a general anti-poverty agency. We're focused on people who are in poverty because of the consequences of conflict and persecution and disaster. And we've got our hands full doing that. And I think we can make a difference in three ways. One, the delivery of services that we do. We think we helped about 27 million people last year around the world, many in health, but not only. Secondly, we can be a benchmark of good practice. We can be the technical resource center for the humanitarian sector. And the third thing is we can advocate on behalf of these people to say that the global safety net, the holes in the global safety net, are a threat to life and livelihood everywhere. And that this disease is a disease that shows that there's a human chain, and we need to make sure it's got strong links, because if we don't do that, then we're all failing. Then we're all likely to fail. So I think I've used up my time. I hope that was in both audible and in some way contributes to the work that you're doing. I'm sorry we don't have a more interactive ability for me to hear from you in live, but thank you very much for the questions. I've been told to click my camera button and my microphone button. So with many thanks for the leadership that you're offering in schools all around. I'm not sure if it's England and Wales or all around the UK, hopefully all around the UK. Good luck to the Education Mutual in what it's doing. And thanks very much to Ken for helping bring us together.